Hi, everybody, and welcome to Lesson 4.9, Toxicology and Human Health. The content in this video is aligned to the third edition of Environmental Science for AP and is aligned to CED Units 8.3, 8.7, 8.12, 8.13, 8.14, and 8.15. Here are our content objectives for this lesson. Human activities, including the use of resources, have physical, chemical, and biological consequences for ecosystems. And pollutants can have both direct and indirect impacts on the health of organisms, including humans. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe endocrine disruptors, describe the effects of endocrine disruptors on ecosystems, describe the effect of persistent organic pollutants on ecosystems, define lethal dose 50% or LD50, evaluate dose response curves, identify sources of human health issues that are linked to pollution, and explain human pathogens and their cycling through the environment. This leads us to answering our guiding question: how does our environment impact our health? Before we begin, it's important for us to understand what we mean when we talk about human health and toxicology. Toxicology is the study of how toxins interact with the body systems of an organism. There are 6 major body systems that we will discuss as they relate to various health hazards. These systems include endocrine, respiratory, digestive, reproductive, nervous, and cardiovascular. It is important to note that the endocrine system is closely tied to the reproductive system in function. The endocrine system releases hormones that help to regulate a variety of processes in the body, including growth and reproductive maturity. The hormones produced by the endocrine system are almost exclusively steroid-based, meaning that they are a specific subclass of lipid macromolecules. The respiratory system is responsible for gas exchange between the internal body system and the atmosphere around it. Gases are transferred between the functional components of the lungs, called alveoli, and blood moving through the cardiovascular system. The digestive system is responsible for intake, breakdown, and absorptions of nutrients through eating and the process of elimination of waste. This system has a large surface area of cells that are designed to absorb various compounds, which make it susceptible to absorbing toxins as well. The reproductive system is designed for reproduction and functions through the interaction of a variety of hormones released from the endocrine system and the gonads themselves. Chemically, females have higher levels of estrogens, while males have higher levels of androgens, although both have a combination of these hormones. The nervous system is responsible for managing the functions of the body, intaking information from the environment, and responding to it via a complex network of synapses and nerves. The nervous system, particularly the frontal portion of the brain, is also responsible for thinking and higher-order decision-making. Lastly, the cardiovascular system is responsible for working in tandem with the respiratory system to ensure that the cells of the body have adequate oxygen to complete cellular respiration, to remove waste gases and compounds like CO2, to provide immune responses, and to transport other nutrients throughout the body. We should also mention that the fat stores of the body, be they under the skin or around the organs, are incredibly important to understanding many toxins. This is because they may be fat-soluble, meaning that they can be absorbed by and stored in fat cells. This causes bioaccumulation, particularly if the compound is not metabolized and excreted from the body. When the organism that has bioaccumulated toxins is eaten by another organism, the toxin can biomagnify in that it becomes more concentrated in the fat cells of the predator organism. While humans are not typically having to worry about transferring toxins higher up the food chain, they do have to worry about eating foods that are high in toxins, such as predatory fish. A toxin is a poison, and the term is frequently used to refer specifically to a protein or conjugated protein substance produced by a living organism that is highly toxic for other living organisms. A compound is considered toxic if it causes illness or death in the organism that comes into contact with it. Examples of toxins include the botulinum protein, commonly known as Botox. This compound is known to interfere with neuromuscular junctions, the locations where motor neurons signal muscles to contract. Botulinum proteins block this signal, making it difficult for the muscles to move. Another example is the tetanus protein, which can cause what is known as lockjaw, where the muscles of the jaw are contracted and are unable to relax. Now that we've defined toxins, it's important to know that not all toxins are created equal. This means that the same amount of two different toxins may have a variety of responses in the body, sometimes no response at all. It is important to remember that the dose makes the poison. The toxicity of a substance is determined by the dosage and then the delivery of the toxin. Dose is typically measured as milligrams of the compound per kilogram of body weight. This allows for the comparison of toxin levels between various organisms with similar body systems, or between different individuals of the same species. For instance, water and caffeine can be toxic, but only at very high doses. 6 liters of water in a short time could kill you. 118 coffees in a short time could kill you. In fact, it could cause severe cardiac arrest. Common substances that we are in contact with every day have toxic levels. However, most of us are not exposed to them at dangerous concentrations. In addition to the dose, the delivery of the toxin is important. Delivery in this sense is talking about our mode of exposure. If a toxin must go through the digestive system to cause a response, simply touching it is often not enough to trigger the response. However, some toxins may have multiple modes of delivery that trigger different responses at different levels. When discussing toxicity and response, we use what is called a dose-response curve. This curve is plotted on a scale where response is on the y-axis and is often measured in percentage of mortality, while the dose is plotted in a log scale on the x-axis. Note the y-axis can also be measured in generic percentage responses, whatever the response is for that particular toxin or compound. The major data that we can glean from this dose-response curve is what is known as the lethal dose of 50%, or the LD50. This value is determined by finding the 50% mark on the response axis, drawing a line to the plotted curve, and then drawing a line down to the dose axis. The star on this graph demonstrates where the LD50 would be on this graph. Additionally, we also identify the value known as threshold, which is the first dose at which response is demonstrated. In this graph, it is indicated by the arrow. Let's take a look at different ways in which a dose-response curve can be used in a variety of circumstances. Here, you see a dose-response graph that shows 3 different curves. This shows us the 3 levels of particular drug therapy. Those 3 levels are the therapeutic effect, ED50, the toxic effect, TD50, and the lethal effect, LD50. Let's talk about each of these in turn. The therapeutic effect curve shows us a measure of positive responses from a drug therapy. The ED50 tells us the lowest possible dosage that achieves the effects we want to see in our test population over a 2-week period. Above the ED50, an increasing dosage often leads to more negative side effects. Here, the threshold is the dosage at which we first see positive effects of the drug. The toxic effect curve shows us the dosage that is likely to cause negative side effects, but does not cause death. This, the TD50, is also measured over a 2-week period in a sample population. Here, the threshold is the first place we see negative effects begin. Lastly, we have the main component we will be using in our understanding of toxicity. That is the lethal dose curve. The LD50, like the others, is measured as the dose it takes to kill 50% of the test population in 2 weeks. The threshold is the first dose at which deaths are recorded. One of the things to note about LD50 is that it can be used to compare a variety of different substances. The lower the LD50, the more potent the toxin is. Often, a lower threshold can signal a highly potent toxin, but it is not always the case. Here, you can take a look at this graph. Spend a moment making sure you understand what the LD50 asks you. When we look at toxins, we typically describe them in terms of what kind of response they cause. A broad category is called a systemic irritant, which is something that may have a variety of effects across multiple body systems, often like those things that make one ill with gastrointestinal issues. More commonly, environmental toxins are going to fall into one of three broad categories: mutagens, neurotoxins, and endocrine disruptors. Mutagens are compounds that trigger a mutation in the subject. There are two more specific categories of mutagens: carcinogens, which attack somatic cells, or those that make up the normal body systems and cause uncontrolled cell division. This can lead to various cancer formations. The other is a teratogen, which attack germ cells, or those that are used in reproduction, the sperm and the egg, and can cause birth defects. Teratogens are also compounds that can cause issues if a pregnant woman is exposed to them. Neurotoxins are compounds that affect the function of the brain or the nervous system, although the brain is most commonly attacked. Lastly, endocrine disruptors are those compounds that mimic the hormones produced by your endocrine system, and they often lead to massive changes in the way the body functions and responds in a variety of instances. Here, you see some examples of pollutants and toxins as they fall into a variety of categories. It is important to note that a compound can have multiple effects or fall into multiple categories of toxicity. Mercury, for example, is a neurotoxin, teratogen, and can be an endocrine disruptor if it goes through the appropriate metabolic changes. An additional thing to note is that many of these compounds are ones that we come into contact with every day: pipes, paint, thermometers, nonstick pans, insulation. These are substances that are likely in our homes or in the places we work. Phthalates can leach out of plastic bottles left in the heat and enter your drinking water. PFCs are ubiquitous in the world due to the production of nonstick pans. Exposure to these compounds in the right dose through the right mode of delivery can lead to negative effects in our bodies. Let's take a quick look at the variety of effects pollutant compounds, which many of these are, have on various body systems. Then we'll take a moment to talk about the dirty dozen and endocrine disruptors in more detail. This image shows that different kinds of pollution, air, water, and soil, can have a variety of impacts on the body as a whole and to specific systems. Notice that air pollution more commonly affects the cardiovascular system and, in some cases, the gastrointestinal system. Water pollution often induces bacteria, parasites, and other chemical agents to the body that often show up or become an issue in the gastrointestinal system. However, they can impact things like the skin and the nervous system. Endocrine disruptors work by mimicking or in some way changing the function of a hormone in the body. Most often, the hormones affected are germ cell hormones, such as those coming from the egg and the sperm. However, endocrine disruptors can cause problems in other body systems as well. The diagram here describes how endocrine disruptors function. They can be categorized as either a hormone mimic or a hormone blocker. Hormone mimics, like BPA and phthalates, appear similar to the actual hormone in the body. In this case, the hormone is the sex hormone estrogen. The body responds to the compound as if it were estrogen, thus producing cellular responses. Exceptionally high levels of estrogen can lead to precocious or early onset puberty. Extreme examples have been found where young girls begin puberty at age 5. In utero, or in the uterus, high levels of estrogen can lead to complete androgen insensitivity in a male fetus, also known as testicular feminization syndrome. This causes a genetic male child to develop female characteristics, including the external genitalia. The child may not know that they are genetically male until they reach puberty and do not have their menses. It's important to note these are extreme examples of endocrine disruptors, but they show that there are problems associated with these compounds in the human body. A hormone blocker does just that. It blocks the response of the natural hormone in the body. A disease is any impaired function of the body with a characteristic set of symptoms. Here, we will specifically be talking about infectious diseases, or diseases that can be passed from one person or organism to another through a particular mode of transportation. Pathogens are responsible for the transmission of infectious diseases. These pathogens can be bacteria, viruses, or parasites. Let's look at some terminology related to disease and transmission. To discuss infectious disease, we have to talk about modes of transmission and the ways in which we categorize diseases. Generally, diseases are identified as being either acute or chronic, meaning that they are sudden onset and fast resolving, or that they come on gradually and last for a long time. The flu would be considered an acute illness, while asthma is chronic. Additionally, it is important to understand how an instance of the disease compares to the population history as a whole. Diseases that are common in an area at a particular level are considered endemic diseases. The flu, for example, is endemic, as it appears at relatively predictable times with relatively predictable percentages. An epidemic occurs when a disease appears in higher than expected numbers in a single country or continent. Pandemics occur when a disease spreads to 2 or more continents. Diseases are spread through direct or indirect contact. The contact point is the actual carrier of the disease. For example, if you pass by a person who sneezes and you breathe in the droplets that they expelled, you are directly in contact with the carrier. However, if the person sneezes on a door handle, walks away, and then you use the same door, that is indirect contact. We can further discuss disease transmission by figuring out how it goes from one host to the next. Most diseases are either waterborne, like cholera, or airborne, like the common cold. Some are considered zoonotic, meaning that they originate in an animal and get passed on to humans, usually through a bite or eating tainted meat or organs. Vector-carried diseases are those that are transmitted from person to person via an organism like a mosquito, who picks up blood from one host and carries it on to the next. Some diseases can be spread through reservoirs, or locations, organisms, or objects that have been contaminated with the pathogen and can then spread it to another individual. Lastly, some diseases are spread through sexual contact, like STIs, HIV, and AIDS. Here are some of the most common diseases that you should be familiar with regarding their transmission and type. As you can see, the majority of diseases are either airborne or animal vector, with those vector diseases being most common in tropical areas. Across the 3 animal vector diseases, the common thread is the mosquito, which is responsible as the carrier of the disease from one host to another. Additionally, the majority of diseases we come into contact with are considered highly infectious viral diseases. It is also important to note that the diseases that are bacterial or parasitic are almost exclusively waterborne or animal vector transmitted, as these pathogens have very different considerations for survival than do non-living viruses. It is important for you to be familiar with these different kinds of diseases based on their transmission and their type. We end this discussion on the idea of a cost-benefit analysis, which in relation to diseases is called a risk-benefit analysis. In this case, we are often looking at whether the treatment is more damaging than the disease, or is it better to build a natural immunity to a disease than to have it triggered via vaccination. For example, the risk-benefit analysis of getting varicella zoster, the virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, is very different in a child than it is in an adult. Furthermore, it would be different in a 25-year-old than a 55-year-old. It is important that the disease itself, as well as the long-term effects of infection, are considered when deciding upon various routes of treatment. However, it is important that the consequences of the treatment be explored as well, including side effects, effective doses, and the overall efficacy or usefulness of the drug itself. The following slide provides you with an opportunity to see how some of these ideas are connected together. Feel free to pause the video and explore the connections between these topics. Then, use the statements at the beginning to review.